I'm Michelle Tucson, president of NACBS, and this is a wonderful turnout, and I'm really looking forward to our session today featuring Catherine Hall's new book, Lucky Valley. These book talks are one of the benefits of NACBS membership, and I think have really helped us build intellectual community and keep connected to one another before we see each other again in Denver in November. They are also one of my favorite new initiatives. I'd like to thank Amanda Perry, our executive director, for organizing this and our other book launch events. Please sign up for them if in the newsletter so you can see what else is going on. Today, I have the honor of introducing our event with Catherine Hall in conversation with Antoinette Burton about Lucky Valley. Thank you both for joining us today. Our session will go for, they usually go for about an hour with time for questions from the audience at the end, though we may go over with the size of the group, so please stay with us as long as you'd like. We'll record it. If you miss anything, you certainly can go to the recording. Please put your questions in the chat at any time during the session, and I will pose them to the panelists, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. I'll start with introductions, and then we'll get on to our conversation. Catherine Hall is Emerita Professor of History and Chair of the Center of the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery at UCL. She has written extensively on the history of Britain, gender, and empire, including Family Fortunes, Civilizing Subjects, Macaulay and Sons, with others, the legacies of British slave ownership. From 2009 to 2016, she was principal investigator on the LBS project, and I can put that link in the chat for us. Her latest book and the subject of our conversation today, of course, is the full title is Lucky Valley, Edward Long and the History of Racial Capitalism. It came out with Cambridge in 2024. Our panelist, Antoinette Burton, is a historian of 19th and 20th century Britain and its empire, with a specialty in colonial India at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's written on topics ranging from feminism and colonialism to the relationship of empire to the nation and to the relationships of empire to the nation and to the world. Women, gender, and sexuality have always been central to her research, which has drawn on intersectional method to privilege race as a modality in which both identities and systems are lived. She's edited collections about politics, mobility, post-colonialism, animals, and world histories from below, and has frequently collaborated with Tony Valentine. She's the author of a Key Thinkers essay on Catherine Hall, part of Bloomsbury's Theory and Method series that was published in 2020. Her most recent book, Gender History, A Very Short Introduction, was published by Oxford University Press earlier this year. A co-edited collection with Ranissa Amawani and Samantha Frost called Biocultural Empire is due out with Bloomsbury in December. I welcome you both to this session. I'm going to hand the floor over to Catherine for some introductory remarks, which will be followed by a comment from Antoinette, and then some questions, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience, for questions. Again, put those in the chat, and I'll be recording them and then posing them at the end. Please take it away, Catherine.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to do this session. And this opportunity to be asked difficult questions by my friend Antoinette, and to encounter other people that are here. And thank you to the NACBS for making this possible. So we planned that I would say just a little at the beginning about Lucky Valley and why I set about writing it. Or rather what I think I've done now I've written it, because I certainly didn't know when I started that this is how it would end up. And then we'll turn to Antoinette. Well, Edward Long's journey in the 18th century, in the mid-18th century, was out to colonial Jamaica and back to metropolitan Britain. And the riches that were made possible for him by the work of the enslaved in Jamaica and the plantation Lucky Valley that he owned, made it possible for him to return to England and write the history of Jamaica. And in the writing of the history of Jamaica, he described the making of a racial mind. So it's the making of the riches and the making of the mind that in a way is at the heart of what I've tried to do, because of course I'm also reflecting on the ways in which what he was describing and making was also the world which in a different figuration, but recognizable figuration, we still live in. One of the, I suppose, the key issue for me in these last however many years since I've been working on Jamaica is what happened. How was it that the English managed to forget slavery when in the period between the mid-18th century and emancipation, it was such a present subject and preoccupation? How it got forgotten and only surfaced periodically in the decades that followed. And then, of course, how it surfaced most spectacularly with the coming of the West Indians to Britain from the mid-20th century and the eruption of that history as now being lived in the present. So that moment when, as they told us so clearly, we are here because you were there, brought the question of slavery back, slowly back into English consciousness. And in a way, that's what I've been preoccupied with. Well, it is what I've been preoccupied with from the writing of civilizing subjects onwards. But I also have a long-term interest in trying to understand capitalism in relation initially not just to class, but also to gender and race. And so from the beginning, Family Fortunes, the book that I did with Leonora Davidoff, that long project on the gendering of the middle class in 19th century England, late 18th, early 19th century England, it posed the question, what the relation was between the development of particular forms of entrepreneurial, professional, and mercantile capitalism. Not so much industrial, because we weren't working on the areas where industrial capitalism was really crucial at that point. How to connect those stories of capitalism, gender, and of capitalism and gender and class, and insist on, as was so necessary at that time in the 70s and 80s, on the centrality of gender to any understanding of class. That was what was extremely original about that book and that moment, and about feminist history, of course. Well, as I was working then on civilizing subjects, which was about trying to understand how race came to be present in English society in a way which had not been reflected on to any great extent, it became clear to me then, working on Long, that the question of the relationship between colonialism and capitalism, and race and capitalism, was deeply illuminated, richly illuminated in the history of Jamaica. And that it's actually, the history of Jamaica is telling us about the workings of what we now call racial capitalism. So, I mean, in the 70s, I might have called it gendered capitalism. In the 80s, the term racial capitalism wasn't around, but obviously what I was preoccupied with was the development of culture of racism in that period in Britain and its relationship to Jamaica. And in Lucky Valley, I've returned to the question of the economy and capitalism in a central way. So racial capitalism became the term that I found very helpful in thinking about what exactly was going on in the 3 volumes of the history of Jamaica. So that was one point I wanted to make. Then I wanted to say that over a long period, I've been really interested in the significance of both history writing and literature in the making of racial difference. And I started working on texts in that way a long time ago. So Edward Long is just the last in a whole series of writers that I've worked on. So in Civilizing Subject, I was working on Trollope. I worked a lot on Thackeray and Vanity Fair. Wrote a long essay on that, which was Vanity Fair was C.L.R. James's favorite novel, and he reread it every year. And I found that just such an extraordinary thing and so fascinating. So thinking about why it was that, you know, this book fascinated this European West Indian as he was, and how it reflected on the presence, the hidden presence of race in 19th century England, and so on. I taught Dickens. I was very much influenced by Morrison's Playing in the Dark. I worked on Martineau. So those connections between literature and history have always been really, really important to me. And the whole way in which the dead are present in our everyday lives. They're not visible, but nor are they absent, as St. Augustine said many, many generations ago. So it's interesting. I was reading Hilary Mantel's lecture on literature and history, on writing historical fiction the other day. And I was really fascinated to see how she sees the work of writing historical fiction as taking the past out of the archive and putting it into the body. Well, I think some historians have always been doing that. And obviously critical fabulation is one of the ways in which that's being done now. But you don't need to be a critical fabulist to do it either. And I think that way of thinking about history through individual lives and family lives and the imagining of those lives, as Macaulay said, history has to be burned into the imagination before it can be received by reason. So the imaginative is as important to me as the attempted theorization of racial capitalism in Lucky Valley. So one further point, when I started working on Edward Long and the history of Jamaica, I assumed that the project would be about attempting to understand and destroy the binaries, the essential, the notions of essential and natural racial difference, which is obviously his project. And it was only gradually that the whole question of racial capitalism became so much more significant to me. But still, that work of unpicking racial binaries, which remains so important and present right into the moment we're now living, is absolutely central to what I was trying to do by unpicking his arguments, by demonstrating the contradictions, by showing how he couldn't actually maintain those fictions himself. I hope to contribute to that unpicking of racial difference. And I wanted to quote Césaire, who I was reminded the other day wrote about how no race holds a monopoly of beauty, of intelligence, and of strength. There is a place for all of us at the rendezvous of victory. And that's such an eloquent way of saying that we all belong in this human world in our very different and unequal ways. So let me now turn to Antoinette.
Great, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to the NACBS for inviting me into conversation with Catherine Hall about her book. Catherine and I have spent many hours talking about Edward Long in the last 10 years, as well as about subjects and issues related to the Lucky Valley Project. But I hardly ever get to share a platform with her or to speak about and to her in public about her work. So I'm grateful to have that opportunity today. I want to say a few things about what I think the book accomplishes, and then, as Catherine referred to, offer a few questions directly to her. And if I remember, I'll also put them in the chat. So most obviously, this study establishes a takeoff point in time and place for any historically grounded understanding of how processes of enslavement and colonialism work together, and were so profoundly entwined that it becomes impossible to think one without the other. This is not something that is self-evident, let alone so relentlessly empirically proven in current Anglophone historiographies, which tend to segregate at worst and elusively connect at best that dialectical relationship. In Lucky Valley, through Catherine's deep and detailed work and her characteristically careful unpicking of texts and contexts, we have an unprecedented account of what Brené Bondar has called the racial regime of ownership that undergirded the system of colonial slavery in Jamaica. Consequently, Lucky Valley is an origin story of Anglophone racial capitalism through a socialist feminist lens. I'm very glad that Catherine, in her remarks, looked a little bit backward. I thought maybe the latter phrasing of socialist feminist would feel anachronistic to some, but in the broadest sense, I think it captures at least part of the interpretive toolkit that Catherine has consistently brought to bear on her career-long work, and it's very much in evidence here. It's especially visible in what she nominates as the pillars of her argument: racialization, reproduction, racial capitalism, and disavowal, which is to say that systems of race and sexuality and gender and class are intertwined, that they are all subject to historical processes that are as materialist as they are discursive, that they are dynamic processes rather than static givens, through which we can see the very makings of colonial slavery at work, and that they are visible not only, but crucially, through a psychoanalytic prism, one which holds the material and the affective, the real and the phantasmic in creative tension. These insights, commitments, and convictions come out of an earlier moment in the history of British history. Not to say that Catherine's work has not moved and pushed the field in significant ways since Family Fortunes in 1987, or that she herself has not been transformed by post-imperial British histories. But it's important, I think, to take the long view of this book and return to earlier debates about Britain and empire before the relatively recent and, of course, faltering and by no means established acceptance of the imperial turn. For me, Lucky Valley is an exemplar of anti-colonial design and method, which is to say it pursues a model of history writing and practice, which doesn't just identify or identify with imperial power and ambition, but endeavors to exceed the epistemological frames which imperialism itself bequeaths to us, and often, even in the best post-colonial work, also seduces us into. Her chosen strategy is biography. In this case, of course, Long, but also the biography of the plantation and the biography of a text whose extensive and influential life warrants the attention of anyone seeking to understand the origins and histories of racial capitalism, both in place and beyond. I want to return to this question of anti-colonial method in a minute, but for now I would say that it does not presume that colonialism was a given. It insists that the racial in racial capitalism is processual, relational, historically contingent, and it reaches for the fugitive, enslaved, and colonial subject wherever it can, within and beyond the limits of the archive, without being sanguine about the availability of enslaved voices or colonized experience. Lucky Valley is arguably a primer for 18th century English, colonial, and global history. It's the world in a grain of sand. That sand, or beach, really, is Long's history, which Catherine teases out to help us apprehend the length and breadth of planter ideology and fantasy. The way the book moves across geographies, breaks down place and space into fields and streets and households, the contextual environment of political pamphlets and economic tracts and novelistic influences, it opens up the multiverse that Long and his metropolitan contemporaries inhabited and struggled to master. That struggle, the far from inevitable or stable claim to white supremacy which the book relentlessly pursues, focuses on Long's own inability to fix race, racial identity, racialized people, and communities. That failure is at the heart of this story. Catherine never denies the violence and cruelty underpinning this terrible project. She is also adept at backlighting its cracks and fissures and picking away at the gaps between what is ascribed to enslaved peoples or colonial subjects and what the social and economic realities were. Her ability to see the spaces in between and to effectively show us the trouble with empire is a major anti-colonial methodological contribution to imperial history writ large. Last, if Lucky Valley is the story of Long's chase for racial fixity in service of the interests of his family, Jamaican planters, and white supremacy, it is, in a sub rosa or contrapuntal way, also an interspecies history, one in which we are reminded through Long's own fantasies and preoccupations of how embedded systems and ideologies of racecraft are in more than human worlds. From Long digging with his bare hands in the marl pit to specters of monstrous creatures at the heart of his interracial sexual anxiety connected to white reproductive futurity and the instability of the political economy of colonial capitalism, it's all there. In these textual constructions of cross-species fear and loathing, we also see some serious trouble with empire, with the presumption of the white proto-liberal sovereign subject trying to keep the subsoil at bay as he makes his profit from it, from black and brown hands that are coerced into tilling it, and from the status hierarchies that distancing himself from it make possible. Lucky Valley is quicksand, where quicksand is not a metaphor, but itself the very grounds of the kinds of disavowal that drove long-sustained anti-Black rant, which he put between covers and called, quote unquote, a history, and which we inherit as one of the foundational genealogies of racial capitalism today. I could go on and on about the architecture of the book itself, about its place in the historiography of grand narratives about British imperialism, and about who will read this book and teach it, and in what place-based context. But I need to move on to a few questions. So I'm going to ask them of Catherine all at once, and then I'll put them in the chat. And Catherine has seen them ahead. I thought that was only fair. They're kind of a mouthful. So, Catherine, just do what you want with them. And if you feel like pivoting to the wider audience, that's fine too. So my first question is this. You've written in the preface about the emotional meaning of place, Lucky Valley, and Jamaica. Why is a rigorously place-based history of racial capitalism important in and of itself, but also for the moment that we're now living in? Second, I taught your book in a graduate seminar last week, and shout out to some of the students who helped me frame this question. And among the many things they loved and were eager to talk about were your references to unwitting archives and to the way that Long's disavowal of the labor of Black and brown people in the plantation complex shapes what can and cannot be seen in his history. Can you talk about your approach to the archives of racial capitalism which inform Lucky Valley? And last, in his 2015 essay on the career of the Oxford Don John Darwin and John Darwin's unsentimental education approach to imperial history writing, Bill Schwartz insightfully observed that much of the controversy in British and British imperial history in a post-colonial, decolonizing, or anti-colonial mode turns on what we can expect history to do. What expectations do you have of history as a form of political engagement, as a practice of repair, or as an intervention in the present?
Well, let me say thank you for your wonderfully eloquent account of Lucky Valley. And then turn to this question about the importance of place to a history of racial capitalism, both then and in the present. Well, I suppose my immediate answer to that is that a lot of the discussion of racial capitalism is not based on historical specificities. And it seems to me that it's essential that it should be. And that what we need to know is how this thing, which isn't a thing, that we're calling racial capitalism, this set of relations between racisms and capitalisms, which neither of which are fixed, both of which are malleable, and take their specific forms in specific times and places. How do they work? How does it actually work? So when you see placards at political demonstrations saying end racial capitalism, you think, well, or I think, well, I wonder how people understand that. What do they think the system is now? And I suppose what I wanted to explore in this piece of work is, well, what was it then? How did the articulation between race and capitalism work? I mean, that's why I started this morning for you, by saying that I think it goes back to the question about the articulations of capitalism with whether it's gender, sexuality, race, whatever the articulations are, that's been a preoccupation forever because, and that of course, you're right, Antoinette, that goes back to very early identification of me as a socialist feminist and thinking that, you know, being educated into at least some form of Marxism and then realizing that really didn't offer the answers that I wanted. And so how did gender work in relation to capitalism, which was what we explored in Family Fortunes? And then that question of the articulation went out of my mind as I became so much a cultural historian. And it's really only years later that I've come back to the economy. And of course, the reason for that is the project, the Legacies project at UCL, which put the question of money and the economy as one of the central issues. And I learned so much from that collaborative work on the LBS project. And it made me think again about money, profit, the cash nexus, the market, the bill of exchange, which of course I knew nothing about until I was educated into all of that, and those questions. So the reason why place and time, because it's temporality and specificity, and this is absolutely, I mean, I think one helpful way of thinking about Lucky Valley is that it's a case study in a particular moment of a particular set of relations, which we can call a moment of racial capitalist organization. But it will be different it's different in Mississippi Valley that Walter Johnson writes about in the mid-19th century, or it's different in the 20th century. It doesn't, and it's different it works very differently in India during the period of empire from the way in which it works in Britain. It works very differently in the white settler colonies. So all of these are different ways of thinking about the articulation between race and capitalism. But in order to do that, it has to be really specific. So it takes me to Jamaica, and it takes me to the parish of Clarendon, and it takes me, and of course, Edward Long takes me to the topography of Jamaica. And what first gripped me about reading the history, and, you know, it's a text that anybody who works on the Caribbean knows Edward Long. but most people know some fragments of Long. Very few people read all 3 volumes for very good reasons. But the section that really first caught my imagination was his whole description, which is half of volume 2 of the island. And it's absolutely clear that he knows the island and loves the island. He loves it physically. It's valleys, it's mountains, it's woods, it's plantations that people like him have created. And I found I was following him through his description of it and remembering so vividly being there myself and impressed by how correct his accounts are of what the island is like. And of course, he's describing it in the mid-18th century. I'm seeing it properly for the first time in the 1970s, 1980s. So that was terribly important. And then being rooted in place, knowing the context of the geography of what Lucky Valley, the plantation, what is, how does it, what's it like? Where are the hills? Where was the mill? Where was the house? All of those questions. All it is now, it's still cane fields, but all the buildings have gone. There are fragments of pottery. There are fragments of the water wheel that we found on one of our journeys there. It's been a process of discovery. Nobody knew where Lucky Valley was when I first went there. Actually finding the place was an entire adventure in itself. But also, how far was Lucky Valley from Spanish Town? Because that's where his main house was. How long does it take to get from the plantation to the wharf at Old Harbour, which is, funnily enough, the small town on the sea that my husband Stuart's paternal family lived in. So there were all these connections that became vivid as I worked on it. And then there's the English side, discovering the house he lived in that he grew up in Cornwall, and where his image of a gentleman's life comes from, what his idea of what a farm should be like comes from, why he loves the sea. He grew up near the sea. All these things that became terribly important for me. What was Chichester like in the 1770s, the place that he substantially wrote the history of Jamaica? There certainly were not any Black people there, or literally 1 or 2 possibly. It was not like London. What was Wimpole Street like, where he also had a house and where lots of West Indians lived? In the plantations, where did the enslaved live? Where were they buried? No idea. Nobody knows. All these questions. So using my own journeying to these places, together with his descriptions, together with the visual material that I could find, together with the maps, together with the literature that he uses, the poetry that is so important to him in evoking the beauties and the extraordinary character of Jamaica, and so on. So then, just one more point about that is where he's buried and what that's come to mean, and the debates that have now resulted in the church that he's buried in about what it means to have his memorial there and what to do about it. So that's trying to think about place and specificity. So Unwitting Archives was your, what some of the group that you were discussing it with wanted to think about. What can and can't be seen? Well, obviously, there's all the contradictions, the slips, the things that don't work, the dreams, which are so important to me, the giveaways, the words that carry meanings that he doesn't intend at all, the whole question of anxiety, which is so central to him, which he sees as, at some point in the history, he says how anxiety has killed so many of the colonists. And when you look very carefully at what he's saying about, you know, all the terrible problems that planters face, which is how he explains the anxiety that literally kills these people. And then you see that, you know, what's popping up there in that sentence? Fire. And you realize that, you know, the thing that he can't actually bear to think about, which is the firing of the burning of plantations, the burning of that goes on in 1760 in the revolt, that's what's lurking in his imagination, which he's trying to put down. He does not want to think about it. I mean, so much of the history of Jamaica is the hard work of repressing all the things that he doesn't want to think about. And of course, my job as a contemporary historian is to try and pinpoint them and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, one very interesting example of this is that he has a whole chapter in the history of Jamaica, which is an attack on Francis Williams. And Francis Williams was a Black Jamaican, free Black Jamaican. His father had been enslaved and was freed by his owner. And Francis Williams' father became a wealthy merchant who moved between London and Jamaica and, of course, owned significant numbers of enslaved people and left Francis Williams with significant property. And Francis Williams was partially educated in England, and he became a kind of test case of a Black man who could write poetry in Latin, which of course Africans were not supposed to be able to do. There was a whole number of African writers who who were used as tests in the late 18th century. Well, you know, can they only mimic, or is there something more going on? Phyllis Wheatley would be probably the person who would be best known in the US. Anyway, Long's attack on Francis Williams is incredibly important to him because it comes at the end of his whole discourse on essential racial difference, natural inequality, natural hierarchy. And of course, Francis Williams challenges that because he's an 18th century gentleman. He owns enslaved property. He started a school for Black boys and so on. And he writes these Latin poems welcoming new governors to Jamaica, which was a kind of ceremonial moment. Anyway, I'm almost certain that I can never be certain. You can never absolutely know these things, that Edward Long was looking at the portrait of Francis Williams, which he owned, as he writes this chapter, because he describes him physically. And of course, it enrages him that he wears a wig and he has smart clothes and he has scientific instruments. And this painting was sold by Edward Long's descendants to the Victoria and Albert Museum in the 1920s, bought not because of its interest in the Black figure, but because of the mahogany furniture, which the V&A were very interested in. Of course, mahogany furniture probably crafted in Jamaica, which is a very interesting thing in itself. Anyway, if you look at this portrait, it's now become, of course, a source of great interest. And it's still owned by the V&A, and now there are exhibitions about it and investigations of it and new writing about it. But what it also gives us a glimpse into is not kind of the Black man as somebody who is absolutely resisting slavery and hierarchy, but the Black man who wants to be a scholar, who wants to be recognized in white society, who is highly educated and has serious scientific interests, owns enslaved people, mixes in elite circles in Jamaica. He's a challenge to Edward Long, but he also represents very much the challenge of free Black men in Jamaica at that time, which Long absolutely did not want to write about in the rest of the history. So the more I learn about Francis Williams, the more interested I am in this silence in the history about free Black people. It's extraordinary how brief he is about that. So that's the kind of unwitting testimony of the archive that, you know, this is no simple picture of Black resistance. It is a kind of Black resistance, but one that we have to understand in its complex form. So as, you know, Anne Stoler famously said, you always have to read with and against the grain. And reading with Edward Long was as important to me as picking him apart, because I can't pick him apart unless I understand what I think he's doing. So then your third question, so let's be quick on this and leave time for other people. What expectations of history as a form of political engagement and practice of repair? Well, obviously my hope is that a book like Lucky Valley is an effort at repair. It's an effort to undo the Black binary, the Black-white binary, and to remoralize the whole question of race in a different way. And so, you know, what we've seen in the last 20 plus years, more than that now in the UK, is the huge significance of history in debates about the present, and the very passionate feelings on both sides about the history of empire. Now, all of this is very different in the UK from the US, because of course the fight in the UK to start off with is to say slavery is relevant here. It may not have been present in a very significant way domestically, but it's absolutely critical to an understanding of Britain's history. And that in itself has been a huge struggle. You know, why? Why is, you know, this marginal presence of Black people so important? Well, of course, once you start doing the history of empire, it's not marginal at all. Where does the wealth of empire come from? The enslaved, the indentured, the forced labor, the, you know, everything, the raw materials, the lands, the whole story of colonialism. But there's been a very significant pushback to the attempts to rewrite and rethink that history. And we're still in the middle of all of that. And the culture wars are, as you know, unfortunately still very present. The right is very well funded, lots of connections into the far right in the US and in Europe. Obviously, you know, populism is a tremendous threat facing us all. So the way in which Britain's history is so locked into people's sense of what it means to be English, what it means to be British, what it means for it to be possible to be Black and British, all of those are absolutely key questions. But what's interesting, just recently, you know, you might look at the recent election and the fact that 4 million people voted for the far-right party Reform, which of course wants to recover our history, meaning the Second World War, which Britain fought all on its own and so on. 4 million people voted for them, including many young people. And yet, in the recent survey on social attitudes, we see that there's been a significant shift in attitudes to Britain's history and in an increasing, much lower level of pride in empire, much more of a critical relation to Britain's history, and a commitment to toleration, diversity, living with difference, living with others. So the social attitudes survey can give us all hope, but what's happening at the level of politics and the press and the arguments over migration can make us all, of course, despair. So history has such a vital part to play, I think, in all of this. And that's what I hope that, projects like the Legacies Project and the kind of writing that I do contribute to how we might encourage and tend to a different consciousness of what Britain's history has been and what Britain's future can be. So let me stop there and think what else is being asked.
Well, thank you both for that. We have a lot to think about, and I want to invite members of the audience to please put your comments or questions in the chat, and I will pose them again. We'll probably run a bit over today. We usually go about an hour. This is being recorded, so if you have to pop out, that's you can always complete it here. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask the first question. I'm remembering back to 2016, Catherine, when you gave that marvelous with Nick Draper and Keith McClelland at the National Museum of African American History at NACBS.
Yes.
That was
Yeah.
that was in November, and it was such a stunning venue to hear about the legacy.
It was marvelous to be there.
I know, and it was just, it left such a powerful impression on myself and many folks that were there. So having you here to talk about Lucky Valley, I just wanted to ask you if you connected that a bit in your comments, the Legacies Project with Lucky Valley. And I wonder, was it sort of a straight line? Were you sort of moving, did you need to create, I always think about the Legacies Project as you creating a sort of archive yourself of sorts, right? And was that archive necessary for you to do this work? Do sometimes we need to not just read against the grain of archives, but really create new ways of imagining information that we have? I could see, I'm sure the Legacies Project is the basis for a number of dissertations. So do you see it as creating an archive, first of all? And did it feel like a straight line really from Legacies to Lucky Valley?
I don't think it feels like a straight line, but it's certainly absolutely connected and indebted to the collaborative work that we did for the Legacies Project. But from the beginning on the Legacies Project, I knew that what I wanted to do was to look at history writing as one aspect of the legacies. And I mean, I think, so much of the way in which the Legacies Project has been understood is about the money, follow the money. That was the key. But following the money was only ever, it was an absolutely vital part of it. But I suppose the most important part for me was following racist thinking and how that would be illuminated by looking at what these slave owners were doing. And it certainly was. So that in the first phase of the Legacies Project, I worked on a whole group of the writings of slave owners, mostly trying at the moment of emancipation, trying to reconfigure racism for the new times and contributing therefore quite directly to the ways in which racialization entered into British culture. And very popular writers, there are so many writers I worked on, whether I can remember, but one of them was the seafaring writer who was at this moment I'm going to forget his name. But as a child, my brother and I had read these marvelous ripping adventures of seamen and so on. And of course, they turn out to be also absolutely embedded in racial thinking. So it's those kinds of, and his father was a significant slave owner. So that was absolutely one of the connections. But it's interesting what you say about, or the way you put it about the archive that we have created through doing this work. So I think I wanted to say this about place. I think one of the most important things we've done is give people the tools to connect the places they live to this history of plantation and slave ownership. So now, you know, it's taught endlessly in schools through people, you know, quite young pupils being able to identify buildings in their hometown or people in their vicinity and make it local, make it connected to them, make it rooted in a world of the early 19th century in a way that you know, was simply not possible before, because we've traced all these people and their addresses. So you can use the address to, you know, you want to find somebody in the middle of the Scottish Highlands, or you want to find somebody in Leamington Spa. You know, I was always so puzzled by the fact that there were so many slave owners in Leamington Spa, but of course it was a delightful Georgian town which they liked to hang out in once they'd, you know, either never been in the Caribbean or come back and made their money. So in that sense, I think we've given a materiality to the archive, which is way beyond, as it were, the compensation papers. It's in all the mappings that we've been able to do. And what's now the work of the center is to link all that through the slave registers to enslaved lives, so that we can link the estates, the owners, the enslaved from this extraordinary archive of the slave registers. All of it eventually is going to be digitized, all of it's going to be available. So yes, there is a whole archive, which of course it's all to do with the development of the digital humanities and the fact that now so much can be made available in such vivid and simple ways to people. So that is, I must say, deeply satisfying, the way in which that's become embedded in educational institutions, in universities, and I mean, all the multiple projects that are being done in the UK now on legacies, you know, whether it's public schools or universities, they all use, of course, everybody uses the database, everybody. It's the starting point for so much. So, and it was the starting point for me with Edward Long.
Thanks very much for that. I've often wondered if we could recreate the spirit of that project in the US, and I wondered what that would look like. But I hope somebody does something along those lines, but thank you. I'm going to now read the questions that we have in the chat. The first one comes from Jeffrey Jones. And Jeffrey says, could you comment on Long's chapters in Volume 1 on the, quote, dependencies of Jamaica around the Caribbean and in Belize and, the Mosquito Coast, right? I think these chapters in particular show Long's disdain for lower classes of white British smugglers and settlers who are also running plantation economies while cultivating alliances with Amerindians. Thank you for a wonderful event.
Well, that's a most interesting comment, because I have to confess instantly that the chapters on the sections on the dependencies, of course I read them and reread them, but I have not studied them in the way that I've studied much of the rest of the volumes. I don't know those places. I couldn't imagine them in the same way. But the point that you make about it, I mean, of course, there's the material about indigeneity, which is very interesting in those, because the indigenous population in Jamaica, as far as Long knew, had totally disappeared. But the point about his class attitudes is really significant. I mean, he is absolutely his hierarchy is absolutely about class, about gender, and about race, and about different races. I mean, those ethnicities he sees as improvable, and those he doesn't, and all the contradictory feelings about that. But he is contemptuous of lower class white people. I mean, for example, he thinks that white domestic servants in Jamaica are hopeless in comparison with having enslaved people to work for you, because anybody who's white in this slave society thinks that they have a significance and importance because they're white, so they won't work in the ways that enslaved people will. So the scale of his hierarchies is just so clear. But I have to say that now I'll have to go back and reread those sections. So thank you for pointing that out to me about his contempt for those people.
The next question comes from Jeff Auerbach. Jeff asks, can you say a bit more about the almost Orwellian name, Lucky Valley, which so clearly was not lucky for many men, women, and children? Did Long himself ever talk about that name?
You bet he never did. It's called that when his great-grandfather buys it in 1682, just before he died. And it was already settled by the Spanish at that time. What the Spanish called it, I do not know. So in the original sale documents, it is Lucky Valley. And of course, it's totally and horribly ironic that that's its name. And yet, of course, it was an extremely lucky place for Long and his family, who lived off it together with Longville for generations. So whether I mean, I have no way of knowing whether he ever actually thought about it. I wish I knew. That's not something I've never found a dream that relates to the name of the place. And he doesn't name it. No, actually, that's an interesting point. How often does he name it? But he uses it all the time as his reference point. So when he's in his long accounts of how to work out what a plantation is worth, what all the costs are, and so on, he's always using Lucky Valley as his reference point, which is very important, of course, for us to be able to know more than we might otherwise know. But I mean, I did think, I thought, is it really appropriate to call the book Lucky Valley? But I hope people will understand that it's ironic, and that irony is a very important tool, as Orwell and many others understood in our unpicking of racial thinking.
Our next question comes from Josie Garza Medina, and the question is about contemporary Jamaica politics. I don't know if you can comment on that, but the question of, is there a far right or an alt-right nationalism in Jamaica that sort of tries to rewrite these histories today?
As far as I know, no, I've never seen anything like that. I mean, there are considerable debates and arguments, as you might imagine, about the history and the extent to which people do and don't want to remember. And the work of forgetting was as important in Jamaica as it was in Britain, so that the way in which that history was, I mean, of course, the history of the plantation was never erased. It couldn't be, because the plantation economy goes on and on and on. But slavery was not talked about. It absolutely was not talked about. And of course, it starts to be talked about again really significantly in the 80s with Marley and the whole, and Rastafarianism, and which of course had an existence long before that, but didn't become a part of popular culture. So the rediscovery of Africa and the connection to Africa, and seeing that as something not to be ashamed of, but something positive and important and to be recovered, is very late, really. So the arguments then, I mean, there are lots of arguments about reparation that go on, concerns about reparation, concerns about very hard work that's been done in Jamaica around that, with places, with, you know, with the old houses, with the companies that are still living, still working like Campari, still producing rum on the old plantations, and the ways in which they've been shamed into thinking about that long history, which they had not wanted to remember at all. So lots of questions about what could reparation possibly mean. Usually, I mean, thought about in terms of memorialization, but also, of course, thought about in terms of money, thought about in terms of the infrastructure, worried about in terms of the levels of corruption, and where would the money go if it actually ever came. All these, they're all questions that are debated and thought about, but I've never come across what you might call an outright reconstruction of that history. So something worth thinking about.
Fascinating. The next question comes from Laura Beers. Laura says, thank you for your talk. I'm teaching your book in my historiography and method grad seminar in a few weeks in our Economic History Week. But I'm conscious that, unlike previous authors that I have done for that week, you are less self-consciously an economic historian, despite the fact that so much of your work involves the sophisticated analysis of financial sources, and the scholars that you are in conversation with are not principally economic historians. What do you think about the increasing division between economic history and other branches of the historical discipline?
I think it's very unfortunate. I think what we need to do is integrate economic history back into history. That history has suffered dreadfully from the kind of compartmentalizations that have taken place. And of course, you know, I've been part of that too. I became a cultural historian. I mean, I said as at one point earlier in this discussion, you know, it seemed in the 1980s that the questions of cultural identity were the overridingly important questions for my generation. And cultural history was such an extraordinarily productive field of work at that time, but we did lose the economy, and then the economists took over economic history and lost the social aspects of it in Britain. I mean, I know this much more, and I don't know whether this would be true in the US. I mean, I know, of course, that there is a new history of capitalism in the US, but there's not much, it hasn't happened to any great extent in Britain. So I would never in a million years claim to be an economic historian. I would say that I've learned to think about the economy and to see the workings of the economy as absolutely crucial to the understanding the workings of society and politics and culture. That what I want to do is, I want to be the kind of historian who thinks across these divided fields, sees gender and sexuality as crucial as race, sees age as important, sees, I mean, Antoinette raised the whole question of species in her her discussion. And one of the things that I've been engaged with since finishing Lucky Valley is working with a small group who worked with me all the way through the writing of Lucky Valley. Wonderful collaborative work we did together. And we've written this article together, which is called Edward Long and Other Animals, which is about to be published shortly. And it's about his complete fascination with the relation between the human and the animal and how to understand that. And it's opened up ways of thinking about Edward Long that I definitely I didn't have when I started. So I find this very encouraging that, whether it's in relation to Francis Williams and thinking about that, or thinking about animals, not only in relation to mosquitoes and horses and so on, which I do in Lucky Valley, but taking it much farther, helped particularly by my friend and colleague, Silvia Sebastiani, who works on the figure of the orangutan, the chimpanzee, the ape, which is so important to these debates in the 18th century and to questions of the relation between the human and the animal. But what it all makes me feel is there is life after Lucky Valley. It's not all over. There's more to be thought about. And that's kind of a relief, because when you finish a big book, you have this dreadful feeling for about 6 months, at least, that, you'll never have another thought in your life again, that you've worn yourself out and it's all done. And what more is there that you can do? So now, thinking about animals, thinking about free Black people, thinking about questions of reparation and repair, life goes on, which I feel very relieved about.
Well, that's very encouraging, I think, for many of us. This next question comes from Kiri Raber, and she asks, you mentioned briefly Long's aversion to think or write about events such as Tacky's revolt, but I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about why that is and how this ties in with the malleability of race in Jamaica, which Long is so seemingly desperate to make more fixed. I'm thinking of contemporary narratives which used events such as Tacky's revolt and the Maroon Wars to try to justify their subjugation of Black enslaved workers. How did the complexity of recognizing Maroon nations in Jamaica tie in with Long's attempts to fix race into a rigid hierarchy? Thank you so much for the talk. I've learned so much today.
Well, of course, he does write. His material on 1760 is absolutely crucial. It's one of the only narratives that we have. So it's been used endlessly because of that. I think it ties in. I mean, I wish I knew what he was actually doing in 1760. I know that the rebels did not get to that part of Clarendon. I know that he served in the militia. I know that he was talking all the time to his brother-in-law, who was the lieutenant governor and who he had tremendous respect for and thought was absolutely crucial to the suppression of the revolt. But when he comes to writing the account, which he does, how many years later? Well, 1760, he's writing it in, right at the end of the 1760s. He's writing it a decade later. And the central importance for him is, of course, to say how it was suppressed, how it wasn't a huge problem at all. Of course, it mattered, but they dealt with it. And to tell a story of Black brutality and the appalling ways in which Black guerrillas, didn't use proper methods of war and so on and so forth. So all those things, but the way in which it ties particularly into this question of racial fixity it's interesting, because one of the things that Long hoped for, I mean, he was in the assembly making legislation in the immediate wake of the rebellion. and he argued for an attempt to expel all the group who were called the Coromantes. And the Coromantes, who were particular, that's the naming they're given by the colonists, but they're an African ethnicity from West Africa, who were particularly known for their warlike qualities. And Vince Brown writes a lot about this in his very important book on Taki, and of course makes heavy use of Edward Long in the process. But the reason why Long was so desperate to get them expelled from the island was that he thought the future of the island lay with the Creoles, with those who were born on the island, who are different from the savage, warlike, barbarian Africans, the saltwater slaves, as they were called, those who are arriving from Africa. And this is where his notions of fixity fall apart completely, because he's both arguing for essential racial difference and at the same time arguing for the capacity of those born on the island, the creolized Africans, to be different, to be more docile, to be more industrious, to be in families, all the things that he wants to happen to make a more settled society. So this hope to get rid of the Coromantes which was unsuccessful. The House of Assembly did not want this legislation because the Coromantes were very good workers. And so it'd been recognized from the early 18th century, their particular skills and their asset as leaders and their dangers associated with them. And what many plantation owners did was make sure that they would only have 2 or 3 Coromantes, and then they would have others of the ethnic groups who were seen to be more passive, etc. So there's a discourse from the early 18th century about Coromantes and their particular capacities, which also reminds us of how, Long's attempt to essentialize racial difference and make all Africans the same. He knows perfectly well they're not the same. He has discussion of the different characteristics of the many different African ethnicities. So these are the contradictions which are right there to be seen in the text, but which of course he disavows. He knows and doesn't know at the same time, and that's how he lives it. And I think that's how, the reason why disavowal is such an important concept for me is that I think it's still how racism works right into the present. I think it's a part of the way in which race is thought about right into the 21st century. You know and you don't know. And the bit of you that knows works incredibly hard not to know and to suppress it, but it will out.
Yes, thank you for that. Antoinette, do you have anything you would like to respond to in the conversation that we've had so far?
Do we have a minute to hear on that point about disavowal, Catherine, on your relationship to the psychoanalytic as a field of inquiry? Our good friend Sally Alexander couldn't make it today, but she's very much in my mind, as I know she's been such an influence on you. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the deep history of your thinking about that.
Well, as well as Sally, I have to say that my sister and my daughter are very much in my mind. They're both Kleinians practicing psychoanalytic, doing clinical work psychoanalytically, and I've learned such a lot from them. I think that what's so important about Klein is that she understands the centrality of splitting to the ways in which the mind works. And of course, it was Freud who originally sees this and talks about disavowal and about the ways in which the mind can know one thing and refuse to know another, and yet how that other is liable to surface in some other way. And I think that's what's so interesting. And a while ago, I wrote an article with my friend who's a historian and psychoanalyst, Daniel Pick, which we published in History Workshop, which is on denial. And it was very helpful also working with him, who's works as a psychoanalyst. But it's that capacity to split and to project, to put the bad feelings, to put the evil, which is in all of us, actually, the capacity to hate as well as the capacity to love, to project it into other people, to put the hated characteristics that you cannot bear about yourself, actually, you project them into the other. And of course, the other writer who would be so important in all of this is Fanon and what he understands about that, and how destructive this is for the white colonizers as well as for those who they degrade and oppress and exploit. What a wretched, wretched system it is that allows this splitting between the supposedly good white and the terrible, evil, dangerous, sexually perverted Black person. So I think will that do to start off with?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, we don't have any more questions in the chat. Would anyone give a minute for folks to respond? Anything else? Any last word? Catherine, would you like to leave us with?
Do we have somebody? No, somebody else has just appeared. No, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you, to Michelle for so kindly introducing it and sharing it, for that memory of that wonderful event in the African American Museum, which was, it was so exciting. It was really a wonderful event because we were there just when it opened. And so it was such a privilege. And we were telling, the story of what we'd done with the Legacies Project. It was completely thrilling. And to Antoinette for her most eloquent account of what the book is about, which I hope she's going to give me a copy of, because she puts it so beautifully. And to all of you for being there and for your questions and comments. And I can see some old friends who are there. I'm very happy to see you and hope you're all well. And I hope to be in New York in January for the AHA, but I must say I feel frightened about what's going to happen between now and then. And I think, my goodness me, the AHA conference is, just on the dates tell everything. And I think, well, I hope it's all okay. And I hope we'll all be able to not feel endangered and desperate, but feel safe and hopeful about the next years for the US as well as for Britain. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Catherine. We're going to be in Montreal next year. No, this year we're in Denver, and NACBS is in Montreal the following year. And I hope that at some point we can see all of you at one of our NACBS conferences. And for those of you who are going to be in Denver, I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again to Amanda for organizing and doing all of the legwork.
Indeed.
It was really a wonderful session. And again, the recording will be available. Thank you again. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Antoinette. It was really wonderful, and hope to see you all in Denver. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.